The most expensive lesson I ever learned was that some people don't love you. They love what they think they can take from you. I should have known something was wrong the moment my sister smiled at me. Madison had never looked that happy when I walked through our parents' front door, especially not after the last 5 years. The house looked exactly the way I remembered it, wrapped in warm white Christmas lights that glowed against the fresh snow covering the front yard. The cedar wreath hanging on the door still carried the faint scent of cinnamon and dried oranges, and somewhere inside I could already hear Bing Crosby singing about a white Christmas. It looked like the kind of home people imagined when they thought about family, comfort, and second chances. I almost believed it myself. Almost. My mother hugged me just tightly enough for the family watching from the living room to believe everything between us had always been perfect. My father gave me a firm pat on the shoulder, the same gesture he had used since I was 12 whenever he wanted to avoid an actual conversation. Madison kissed my cheek as if we were the closest siblings in the world. "Merry Christmas, little brother," she said sweetly. "This year is going to change everything." I smiled because it seemed easier than asking what she meant. I had spent years learning that silence often kept the peace longer than honesty ever could. The dining room looked like something out of a holiday magazine. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath the chandelier. My mother's china had been polished until every plate reflected the candlelight. The table overflowed with roasted turkey, glazed ham, mashed potatoes, sweet potato casserole, green beans, homemade rolls, cranberry sauce, and enough desserts to feed half the neighborhood. My cousins laughed over old stories while my aunt poured wine. My nephews chased each other through the hallway, wearing matching reindeer sweaters. Anyone watching from outside would have called us the perfect American family. They would have been wrong. Throughout dinner, I noticed people looking at me more often than usual. Conversations paused whenever I reached for another dinner roll. Madison kept exchanging quick glances with my parents, tiny silent signals that made my stomach tighten. Even Brandon, her husband, barely touched his food. He looked nervous, though he tried to hide it behind polite smiles. I had negotiated multi-million-dollar business deals during the past year. I knew what people looked like before asking for something they believed they deserved. When dessert finally arrived, my mother stood and gently tapped her wine glass with a spoon. The room became quiet. "Before we open presents," she said warmly, "Madison has something she'd like to share with everyone." Madison stood slowly, smoothing the front of her emerald green dress before lifting her glass. "First," she said, smiling at everyone around the table, "I want to say how grateful I am that our family is together this Christmas." A chorus of agreement echoed around the room. Then she turned toward me. "And I'd especially like to thank Ethan." Every pair of eyes shifted in my direction. I forced a polite smile. "He's always been the smartest one in the family," Madison continued. "And now he's also the most successful." My father nodded proudly as though my success had somehow become his achievement. "Which is why," Madison said, reaching beneath her chair, "he's decided to give our family the greatest Christmas gift we've ever received." She placed a thick folder directly in front of me. The sound of it landing on the polished wood seemed louder than the Christmas music still drifting softly from the living room. I looked down at the cover. My full legal name had already been printed across the first page. My mother beamed. My father folded his hands confidently. Brandon slid a silver pin across the table until it stopped beside my plate. "Go ahead," Madison said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Tell everyone." I looked up, confused. "Tell them what?" She laughed softly, as though I had made an adorable joke. "That you're giving me the $9 million. The room erupted into applause before I said a single word. My cousin smiled. My aunt wiped away emotional tears. Someone even whispered, "That's incredibly generous." I didn't clap. I didn't smile. I simply stared at the folder while my pulse slowed instead of quickened. Because buried beneath the holiday ribbon tied around this performance was something that felt less like a gift and far more like a carefully prepared trap. When I finally opened the folder and turned to the last page, I realized the money wasn't the most dangerous thing they expected me to surrender that night. I did not touch the pen. Instead, I slowly turned the final page again, letting my eyes move across every line while the applause faded into an uncomfortable silence. The document was not a simple gift declaration. It transferred $9 million into a limited liability company that Brandon controlled, made me personally guarantee every outstanding business obligation attached to that company, and included language preventing me from taking legal action against anyone involved in the transaction. If I signed it, I would not just lose my money. I could spend years paying debts that were never mine. I looked up from the papers and met Madison's expectant smile. She believed I would fold under the pressure of 20 relatives staring at me. She believed I was still the same younger brother who had always surrendered without a fight. Maybe she believed that because everyone else at the table believed it too. The truth was, they had spent my entire life teaching me that giving in was what made me a good son. When I was 8 years old, my grandparents gave each of us $100 for Christmas. I had planned to buy my first bicycle with mine. Madison spent her money before New Year's Day, then cried because she wanted the expensive model instead of the basic one she had chosen. My father sat me down in his office and explained that being the younger brother meant making sacrifices. He said family always came before personal wants. By the end of that conversation, my $100 belonged to Madison. Everyone praised me for being mature. I walked to school for another year. It never stopped there. When I was 16, I won a statewide technology competition with software I had spent months building after school. The scholarship covered nearly all of a summer engineering program in California. 2 weeks before I was supposed to leave, Madison announced she wanted to open an online clothing boutique. My parents said supporting her dream would benefit the whole family. My scholarship money suddenly became startup capital. They promised I could attend another program someday. Someday never came. The boutique closed 8 months later. No one ever apologized. During college, I worked nights stocking shelves at a grocery store while taking a full course load during the day. I graduated with honors and accepted my first software engineering position before most of my classmates. My parents congratulated me over the phone, but they skipped the graduation ceremony because Madison and Brandon were hosting a housewarming party the same weekend. My mother mailed me a card that arrived 3 weeks later. Inside she had written, "We knew you would understand." I always understood. That was the problem. Every promotion, every bonus, every accomplishment somehow became another reason I should give more. When my first company succeeded, my father joked that I was finally useful. When I sold my second startup, relatives who had ignored me for years suddenly remembered my birthday. Invitations appeared. Phone calls became frequent. Family dinners were suggested. They all used the same language. We should stick together. We should help each other. We should share our blessings. Somehow those blessings always flowed in one direction. I built my future one 14-hour workday at a time, while everyone else assumed they had helped simply because we shared the same last name. The only person who had never asked me for anything was Ryan. I met him 2 years earlier during a contract negotiation when his law firm represented the company acquiring one of my software platforms. He never treated me like an opportunity. He challenged my decisions when they were weak, defended them when they were right, and reminded me that setting boundaries was not the same as abandoning people. The first time I told him about my family, he listened quietly before asking one question that stayed with me ever since. If strangers treated you the way they do, would you keep inviting them into your life? I never answered because I already knew the truth. Looking around the Christmas table now, I realized every smiling face expected history to repeat itself. They were not celebrating the holiday. They were celebrating what they believed was another guaranteed victory. My father finally cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Well?" he asked with an impatient smile. "Everyone is waiting." I closed the folder carefully, rested both hands on top of it, and looked around the room one person at a time before asking the only question that suddenly mattered. "Before I answer, I want to know something. Did every single one of you already know what was inside this agreement before I walked through the front door tonight? No one answered immediately. The silence stretched across the dining room until even the Christmas music from the living room seemed painfully loud. My aunt lowered her eyes into her coffee. One of my cousins suddenly became fascinated by the dessert plate in front of him. My nephews had stopped laughing somewhere down the hallway, and for the first time that evening the house no longer sounded warm. It sounded cautious. Madison was the first to recover. She let out a soft laugh, as though I had misunderstood something completely obvious. "Ethan, you are making this much more dramatic than it needs to be," she said. "Everyone knows you have done incredibly well. We simply thought this was the perfect opportunity for our family to help each other." I kept my eyes on her. That was not my question. She hesitated for half a second before my father answered instead. "Yes," he said firmly. "We discussed it before you arrived." My mother nodded. "We did not want to surprise you in a negative way. We wanted everything prepared so the evening could stay joyful." I glanced at the thick folder resting beneath my hands. "Prepared," I repeated quietly. "You mean the legal documents were drafted before anyone asked whether I agreed?" Brandon finally leaned forward. His smile looked practiced, the kind people wear during difficult business meetings. "It is only paperwork," he said. "Lawyers always prepare documents in advance. That does not mean anyone is forcing you." I looked directly at him. "Then why is my legal information already filled in? Why are the banking instructions complete? Why is there a signature page waiting for me?" His smile faded just enough for me to notice. Across the table, Madison folded her arms. "Because we knew you would do the right thing," she replied. "You always have." Those 5 words landed harder than she realized. "You always have." She was not talking about generosity. She was talking about predictability. They had never viewed my kindness as a gift. They viewed it as a guarantee. My father leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who believed the discussion was already over. "Son," he began, "let us stop talking like this is some kind of courtroom. Brandon's business hit a rough season. That happens. Families step in when someone stumbles." "With $9 million?" I asked. "With whatever is necessary," he answered without hesitation. "Money comes and goes. Family is forever." I almost smiled at the irony. The same people who had skipped my graduation, forgotten birthdays, ignored years of hard work, and laughed when I left a secure job to build my first company were suddenly experts on the meaning of family. My mother reached across the table and gently touched my hand. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "Madison has children. They need stability. You have already achieved everything you dreamed of. Surely helping your sister will not change your life that much." I slowly withdrew my hand. "Do you know exactly how much debt Brandon's company has?" She blinked. "Well, not exactly." I turned toward my father. "Do you?" He frowned. "That is not the point." "It is exactly the point." I shifted my attention to Brandon again. "How much?" He adjusted his tie before answering. "The business is experiencing temporary cash flow issues." That was not my question either. Madison interrupted before he could continue. "You are acting like we are trying to rob you." Her voice grew sharper. "We are asking for help." I opened the folder once more and lifted the final page so everyone could see it. "Help?" I asked calmly. "This agreement makes me personally responsible for every financial obligation connected to Brandon's company. If new debts appear next month, they become my responsibility. If lawsuits appear next year, they become my responsibility. This is not help. This is permanent liability." Several relatives exchanged uneasy looks. My aunt slowly removed her reading glasses from her purse. "Wait," she said quietly. "That is what it says." Brandon answered before anyone else could speak. "That language is standard. It protects everyone involved." "Everyone?" I asked. "Or everyone except me?" His jaw tightened. Madison stood up so quickly that her chair scraped across the hardwood floor. "Why are you reading every little detail?" she demanded. "Do you not trust your own family?" I met her eyes without raising my voice. "Trust is earned. Contracts exist for the moments when trust is missing. My phone vibrated once inside my jacket pocket. I did not have to check the screen to know who it was. Ryan had promised he would remain nearby in case anything felt wrong. As discreetly as I could, I slipped the phone beneath the edge of the tablecloth and glanced at the notification. It was only 7 words long. Do not sign anything. Check page 11 carefully. My heartbeat remained steady as I quietly turned through the agreement until I reached the page Ryan mentioned. What I found there made every conversation around the table disappear into silence inside my own mind, because someone had attached a document I had never seen before, and beside my printed name was a signature that looked almost exactly like mine. For a moment I wondered if I was imagining it. I lifted the page closer to the chandelier, studying every stroke of ink. The signature looked almost identical to mine. The slight curve in the capital E, the long finish beneath my last name, even the tiny angle I naturally used when writing the letter M. It was convincing enough to fool someone who had never watched me sign an actual document. It was not convincing enough to fool me. My stomach did not drop because I was afraid. It settled because everything suddenly made sense. This dinner had never been about asking. It had been about creating the appearance that I had agreed. I slowly placed the page back onto the table without letting anyone see the expression on my face. Something wrong? Brandon asked, his voice carefully measured. I looked directly at him. Where did this signature come from? His eyes flickered for the briefest instant before he forced a laugh. What are you talking about? I tapped the page with one finger. This signature. Madison leaned over the table without bothering to read the document. You are wasting everyone's time, Ethan. Maybe, I replied calmly. Or maybe someone here expects me not to notice. My father let out a frustrated sigh. Enough with the accusations. Nobody is trying to deceive you. Then explain why there is a signed authorization attached to a contract I have never seen before. No one answered. Instead, Brandon reached toward the folder. Let me see that. I closed it before his hand reached the papers. No. The room became so quiet that I could hear the clock above the fireplace ticking away the seconds. My mother looked from me to Brandon, her smile slowly disappearing. Brandon, she asked carefully, what document is Ethan talking about? It is nothing, Brandon answered quickly. Probably an old draft that was attached by mistake. An old draft with my signature already on it. I asked. That would be an impressive mistake. My phone vibrated again beneath the table. I glanced down discreetly. Ryan had sent another message. Do not accuse anyone yet. Ask who reviewed the documents before tonight. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and followed his advice. Simple question, I said. Who looked through this agreement before dinner? Madison immediately raised her hand. I did. My father nodded. So did I. My mother hesitated before quietly admitting. I read most of it. Brandon folded his arms. My accountant reviewed everything. I continued looking around the table. Anyone else? My uncle slowly lifted his coffee mug. I never saw it. My aunt shook her head. Neither did I. Several cousins quietly admitted they had not seen the paperwork either. They had only been told I planned to make an extraordinary Christmas gift. Their surprise looked genuine. They had been invited to witness a celebration, not a legal transaction. That realization changed the atmosphere immediately. For the first time that evening, some of my relatives stopped looking at me as though I were being selfish and started looking at Brandon with quiet uncertainty. Madison noticed it too. Can we stop turning this into an investigation? She snapped. This is supposed to be Christmas. Exactly, I answered. Which is why I find it interesting that everyone expected me to sign legal documents instead of opening presents. Brandon forced another smile, but the confidence he had worn all evening was beginning to crack. Ethan, if one page was attached incorrectly, we can fix that later. Later? I asked. After I signed everything else? He did not answer. My father rubbed his forehead impatiently. Son, you are focusing on technicalities. No, I replied. I am focusing on responsibility. I looked directly at my mother. If someone handed you paperwork transferring everything you owned, would you call the details technicalities? She lowered her eyes without speaking. Another vibration came from my phone. This time Ryan sent only one sentence. I am outside if you need me. I looked toward the frosted front window where snow continued falling beneath the porch light. Knowing he was there did not make me feel rescued. It reminded me that someone had trusted me enough to let me handle this myself. I slipped my phone away and turned back toward the table. I have one final question before this conversation goes any further, I said. Did anyone here know Brandon's company is currently under financial investigation? The expressions around the table changed all at once. My mother's face drained of color. My father stared at Brandon in disbelief. Madison looked toward her husband instead of answering. Brandon did not say a single word, and in that silence I finally received the answer none of them had expected to give. Brandon's silence lasted only a few seconds, but it was long enough for every person at the table to understand that I had not invented the question. He slowly placed both hands on the edge of the table and forced a calm expression that did not quite reach his eyes. Financial investigation is a misleading phrase, he said. Every growing business deals with audits and regulatory reviews. I nodded once. That is true, but regulatory reviews do not usually cause lenders to freeze credit lines 2 weeks before Christmas. His face stiffened. Madison immediately stepped between us. Where are you getting this information? She demanded. I looked at her quietly. Does it matter where I got it if it is true? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. My father turned toward Brandon for the first time that evening with genuine concern instead of automatic support. Brandon, he asked slowly, is the company actually in trouble? Brandon hesitated before answering. We have experienced temporary setbacks. How temporary? I asked. He ignored me. The market changed faster than expected. Several investors pulled out. We simply need enough liquidity to stabilize operations. How much? I asked again. This time he answered. About $9 million. A heavy silence settled over the dining room. Even the relatives who had defended Madison only minutes earlier exchanged uncertain glances. $9 million. The number had never been random. It was exactly what remained from the sale of my company after taxes and legal fees. My mother looked genuinely confused. Why did you not tell us things were this serious? She whispered. Brandon rubbed his forehead. Because I thought we could solve it privately. I looked at the folder. Privately, in front of 20 relatives. Nobody laughed. Madison finally lost the patient smile she had been wearing all evening. Fine, she said sharply. Yes, the company needs help. Yes, we knew Ethan had the money. What is wrong with asking family? We are not strangers. I met her eyes. You did not ask. She folded her arms. You would have said no. Then you already knew the answer before writing the contract. She looked away. That tiny movement told me more than any speech ever could. She had never expected consent. She had expected pressure to replace it. My father leaned back slowly, clearly trying to process everything at once. Madison, he said, did you know about this signature Ethan found? She answered immediately. Of course not. Brandon. My brother-in-law did not respond quite as quickly. I handled the paperwork through outside consultants. That was not my question, my father replied. Brandon remained silent again. I reached into my jacket and removed my phone. There is something else everyone deserves to know. Madison's eyes narrowed. What are you doing? Checking a message that arrived before dinner. I opened the email Ryan had forwarded earlier that afternoon. I had almost ignored it while driving to my parents' house because I wanted one peaceful Christmas before the year ended. Looking back, I was grateful I had not deleted it. I quietly placed my phone in the center of the table where everyone could see the screen. The email contained a public filing showing Brandon's company had recently been served with multiple notices related to unpaid obligations and pending financial disputes. There was nothing confidential about it. Anyone could have searched for it. Nobody in my family ever had. They had trusted Brandon completely, because trusting him was easier than asking difficult questions. My aunt slowly adjusted her glasses and read the document twice. "Richard," she said to my father, "did you know about any of this?" He shook his head without taking his eyes off the screen. Not a word. My mother looked at Madison with tears beginning to form. "Why did you hide this from us?" Madison reached for her mother's hand, but stopped halfway. "Because if everyone knew how bad things were, nobody would stay calm." I could not help noticing that she still had not apologized. Not for the contract. Not for the hidden debt. Not for the signature that was waiting inside those papers. Her concern was still focused on saving the company, not repairing the trust she had destroyed. I slowly closed the email and slipped my phone back into my pocket. 3 weeks ago, I said quietly, someone requested information about my investment accounts through a financial contact who happened to know Ryan. That was the first moment I realized somebody was trying to estimate exactly how much money I had. I did not know who was asking then. I looked directly at Madison. Now I do. Her face turned pale. "You have known for 3 weeks?" she whispered. "Yes," I answered. "And that is why I walked into this house tonight, already knowing this dinner was never really about Christmas." No one spoke after my last sentence. The only sound in the room was the faint crackling of the fireplace and the soft wind brushing against the windows outside. For the first time that evening, nobody looked at the stack of wrapped presents beneath the Christmas tree. Every eye remained fixed on me. Madison slowly pushed her chair back and stood. "If you knew," she said quietly, "then why did you even come?" I held her gaze without raising my voice. "Because I wanted to know how far my own family was willing to go." She stared at me in disbelief. "You set us up?" I shook my head. "No. I gave everyone the chance to make a different choice." Brandon let out a short laugh that sounded more nervous than confident. "You are acting like this was some elaborate trap." "It was not a trap," I replied. "It was a test. There is a difference." I reached into my jacket and placed a small envelope beside the folder. None of them had noticed it earlier because I had slipped it into my pocket before leaving my apartment that afternoon. 3 weeks ago, after Ryan told me someone had been asking questions about my finances, I hired an independent investigator. Brandon's expression hardened immediately. Madison's eyes widened. My father looked from one face to another without saying a word. "I did not ask anyone to follow you," I continued. "I only wanted to understand why someone suddenly cared so much about my investment accounts." I opened the envelope and removed several printed pages. The report answered that question very quickly. I slid the first page across the table toward my father. It contained publicly available records showing Brandon's company had missed multiple loan payments during the previous 6 months. The second page listed several liens that had been filed against business assets. The third summarized communications between lenders, demanding immediate repayment before the end of the year. None of it came from private sources. Everything had been obtained legally through public records. My father read each page more slowly than the last. "Brandon," he said quietly, "you told us business was slowing down. You never said you were this close to losing everything." Brandon finally stopped pretending, because panic would not have helped. "Neither would lying," my father answered. My mother covered her mouth with one trembling hand. "Madison, did you know all of this?" Madison nodded almost invisibly. Most of it. Most of it," my mother whispered. "You asked your brother to risk everything while hiding the truth from us." Madison's composure finally cracked. "What choice did I have?" she cried. "Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I enjoyed asking him for help? Brandon built that company for our children. If it disappears, everything we have worked for disappears with it." I listened without interrupting. She had expected sympathy. Instead, the room remained silent. Then she looked directly at me. "You have $9 million sitting in investment accounts, Ethan. You can rebuild if something goes wrong. We cannot." I took a slow breath before answering. "That money is not sitting in one account waiting for someone to collect it. It is divided between long-term investments, retirement funds, charitable commitments, and business reserves. More importantly, It represents 15 years of work, thousands of nights without sleep, birthdays I missed, vacations I never took, and risks I accepted when nobody else believed in me. She opened her mouth, but I continued before she could interrupt. Not one person at this table offered to invest when my first company almost failed. Not one person offered to help pay my rent when I spent every dollar keeping my employees on payroll. I carried those risks alone. You do not suddenly become entitled to the reward because it turned out well. Brandon pushed his chair back. You are making this personal. It has always been personal, I answered. You simply assumed I would never admit it. My phone vibrated once more. Ryan had sent a single message. The documents are ready if you decide the conversation is over. I smiled almost imperceptibly before locking the screen again. I had no intention of letting someone else finish this for me. I looked around the table one final time and realized something I had never allowed myself to believe before. Nobody had invited me home because they missed me. They had invited me because they believed I was the solution to a problem they had created themselves. The saddest part was not discovering the truth. The saddest part was realizing I had known it long before I walked through the front door, and I had still hoped they might prove me wrong. Madison looked at me as though she no longer recognized the person sitting across the table. For years, she had always been able to predict my next move. I would apologize even when I had done nothing wrong. I would compromise even when the compromise only cost me something. I would quietly absorb disappointment because keeping the peace had always seemed easier than defending myself. Tonight, for the first time, that version of me never appeared. My mother slowly reached across the table, but instead of taking my hand, she rested hers on the polished wood between us. Ethan, she said softly, we made mistakes. I can see that now, but surely we can still fix this as a family. I looked at her for several seconds before answering. Can we? She nodded quickly. Of course we can. I gently pushed the folder back toward the center of the table. Then tell me something honestly. If my company had failed instead of succeeding, if I had walked into this house asking for $9 million to save my business, would everyone at this table have signed away their retirement accounts, their homes, and their savings to rescue me? No one answered. My father lowered his eyes. My aunt quietly folded her napkin. Brandon stared at the table as though the grain in the wood had suddenly become fascinating. Madison was the only one who attempted an answer. That is different, she said. I nodded slowly. Exactly. Her shoulders sagged because she understood what I meant before I had to explain it. Different had always been another word. For me, different rules, different expectations, different sacrifices. My mother suddenly began to cry. They were not loud tears. They were quiet, exhausted tears that filled the room with a sadness I had not expected to feel. I never wanted you to think we loved you less, she whispered. I believed she meant every word. That was what made the moment so painful. Love was never measured by intentions. It was measured by choices. Mom, I said gently, I do not think you loved me less. I think you expected more from me than you ever expected from Madison. She covered her face with both hands. She always needed more help. No, I answered quietly. She was always allowed to need more help. The distinction settled over the room like fresh snow. Nobody argued because nobody honestly could. My father finally stood from his chair and walked to the window overlooking the front yard. He remained there for several moments before speaking without turning around. I failed both of you, he admitted. I kept telling Ethan to be stronger because I believed he could handle it. I kept protecting Madison because I believed she could not. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing how unfair that became. Madison looked toward him with disbelief. Dad, he slowly turned back toward the table. No, Madison. Your brother should never have been expected to solve every problem simply because he was responsible. She blinked rapidly as though trying to hold back tears of her own. I was afraid, she admitted. Every bill that arrived felt heavier than the last one. Every phone call from another lender made me panic. I convinced myself that Ethan had enough money to make all of it disappear. She looked directly at me. I stopped thinking about what that money actually represented. I listened carefully before reaching into my jacket one final time. Instead of another report or another legal document, I removed a small brass key attached to an old leather keychain. My mother recognized it immediately. "That is your house key," she whispered. I nodded. "The key to this house." I held it in my palm for a moment before placing it gently beside my empty dinner plate. I carried this with me for 15 years because I always wanted to believe I could come home whenever life became difficult. I smiled sadly. Tonight, I realized I have been carrying a memory instead of a home. My mother quietly began crying again. My father closed his eyes. Madison looked at the key as though it weighed far more than metal ever could. "I am not leaving because I hate any of you," I continued. "I am leaving because I finally understand that I cannot keep paying for a place where I have never truly belonged." Before anyone could respond, the front doorbell rang. Every head turned toward the hallway. My phone lit up almost at the same moment with a simple message from Ryan. "I am here whenever you are ready." I slipped the phone back into my pocket, stood from my chair, and looked around the table one last time before quietly saying, "There is one more truth everyone here deserves to hear before I walk out that door forever." The front doorbell echoed through the house a second time, but nobody moved to answer it. Every person at the table remained frozen, waiting for me to finish what I had started. I looked at the familiar faces surrounding me and realized that, despite everything that had happened that evening, I still did not want revenge. I wanted clarity. There was an important difference between the two. I rested one hand on the back of my chair and spoke as calmly as I had all night. "The truth is that I never came here intending to expose anyone. I came because I hoped I had misunderstood everything. I hoped the messages, the financial inquiries, the strange contract, and the pressure I felt leading up to tonight were all unfortunate coincidences." I glanced at Madison before continuing. "I wanted my family to prove me wrong." She lowered her head without saying a word. "Instead," I continued, "every decision made tonight confirmed exactly what I had feared." I picked up the folder one final time and removed a single sheet of paper from the back. "This is not another investigation," I explained. "It is something I signed last week." My father frowned. "What is it?" "A trust agreement." Several confused expressions appeared around the table. I carefully placed the document where everyone could see it. "Months ago, after selling my company, I decided that I never wanted money to become the reason people entered or remained in my life. Ryan encouraged me to think long-term instead of emotionally. Together with my financial advisors, I created a trust that now holds nearly all of my personal assets." Brandon's eyes widened immediately. "What does that mean?" "It means I cannot simply write a $9 million check even if I wanted to. Major distributions require independent approval and must follow the conditions established in the trust. Those conditions exist to protect both the assets and the person who owns them." Madison stared at the document in disbelief. "You did that before Christmas?" "I finalized it before anyone invited me to dinner." The silence that followed felt different from every silence earlier that evening. This one carried resignation instead of tension. Brandon slowly leaned back in his chair. For the first time since I had arrived, he stopped trying to negotiate. My father looked at the trust agreement before raising his eyes toward me. "So there was never any chance this plan could have worked?" I shook my head gently. "Not legally." Madison closed her eyes. "Then why did you let us keep talking?" I answered honestly. "Because I needed to know whether you wanted me or my money." Tears rolled quietly down her face. "I think I already know the answer." I took a slow breath before walking toward the Christmas tree. Beneath its branches sat dozens of wrapped presents waiting for a celebration that no longer existed. I picked up one small gift with my mother's handwriting on the tag and turned it over in my hands. "Do you remember when I was 10 years old?" I asked softly. "You gave me a little compass because you said every man needed something that would help him find his way home." My mother's lips trembled. "I remember." I smiled sadly. "I carried that compass for years. I carefully placed the unopened present back beneath the tree. Tonight, I finally realized that home is not the place you keep returning to. Home is the place where nobody asks you to earn your place by sacrificing yourself. Another quiet knock came from the front door. This time my father walked into the hallway and opened it. Ryan stepped inside, brushing a light layer of snow from his dark winter coat. He did not interrupt the conversation or demand explanations. He simply nodded politely to everyone in the room before looking at me. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said. "I am now," I answered. Brandon watched Ryan with an expression that mixed frustration and defeat. "You knew about all of this?" Ryan remained respectful. I knew Ethan deserved the opportunity to make his own decision without pressure. He reached into his briefcase and placed a sealed envelope on the dining table. Inside are letters confirming that no property belonging to Ethan can be transferred through the documents prepared tonight. There is also formal notice that any signature bearing his name without his direct authorization should never be relied upon for future transactions. Nobody touched the envelope. Nobody argued. I looked at Madison one final time before quietly saying, "You asked me for $9 million, but what I am giving everyone instead is something far more valuable. From this day forward, every relationship we have will be built on honesty, or it will not exist at all." 1 year later, the first snow of December drifted quietly past the wide windows of my new home, covering the neighborhood in the same soft white blanket that had fallen on the night everything changed. Only this time, the silence felt peaceful instead of heavy. The house smelled of fresh pine, cinnamon, and homemade cookies cooling on the kitchen counter. A fire burned gently in the fireplace while quiet holiday music played in the background. It was not a mansion, and it was not the largest house I could have purchased after selling my company, but it was the first place that had ever truly felt like it belonged to me. I finally understood that comfort had very little to do with square footage or expensive furniture. It came from knowing nobody inside expected you to sacrifice yourself just to be accepted. The months after that Christmas had been difficult, but they had also been honest. Brandon's company entered formal restructuring after several lenders refused additional extensions. The legal issues surrounding the questionable paperwork were resolved through proper channels, and every document carrying my unauthorized signature was officially withdrawn before any financial damage could occur. My parents were never forced out of their home because, despite everything that had happened, I quietly made certain the mortgage remained protected through the trust. They never asked how it happened, and I never offered an explanation. Some acts of kindness no longer needed recognition. They simply reflected the person I wanted to become. Madison eventually found a full-time job for the first time in many years. The first conversation we shared after leaving my parents' house lasted less than 10 minutes. She did not ask for money. She simply apologized, not with dramatic speeches or excuses, but with a single sentence that carried more weight than anything she had said the previous Christmas. "I confused your love with your responsibility, and I almost lost my brother because of it." I accepted her apology without pretending that everything had instantly returned to normal. Forgiveness did not erase consequences. It simply allowed both of us to stop carrying the same painful moment into every future conversation. Trust returned slowly, one honest decision at a time. My relationship with my parents changed as well. We spoke less often, but every conversation became more genuine. My father stopped asking about investments and began asking whether I had been sleeping enough. My mother stopped apologizing for the past every time we met and started creating new memories instead. Neither of us could rewrite what had happened, but all of us could choose not to repeat it. As for Ryan, he remained exactly who he had always been. He never measured my worth by my success, my bank account, or the companies I built. When I doubted myself after cutting ties with the version of family I had spent my entire life trying to please, he reminded me that healthy boundaries were not acts of cruelty. They were acts of self-respect. On Christmas Eve, after dinner, He handed me a small envelope instead of a wrapped present. Inside was a letter dated several weeks before I had sold my company. In it, he wrote that regardless of whether my business succeeded or failed, he hoped we would continue building a life together because the person he admired most had nothing to do with numbers on a financial statement. By the time I finished reading, I realized my hands were shaking for an entirely different reason than they had 1 year earlier. Ryan smiled and quietly placed a simple ring on the table between us. There were no grand speeches, no audience waiting for an answer, and no contract hidden beneath the gesture. There was only one question asked with complete sincerity. I answered yes before he even finished asking. Later that evening, I stood beside the window watching snow fall across the quiet street, while laughter filled the house behind me. For the first time in my life, I understood what my mother had once hoped that little compass would teach me. Home is not the place where people expect you to prove your love by giving away pieces of yourself. Home is the place where your presence is already enough. Looking back now, I realize my family never truly asked me for $9 million. They asked me to believe that my value came from what I could provide instead of who I was. Walking away from that belief became the greatest gift I have ever given myself, and finding the courage to build a life surrounded by honesty instead of obligation was worth far more than any fortune I could ever earn.